Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige Q&A session. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast, join our Discord, and ask us questions. Derek, this week we've got a question coming to us from Hootie F/A-18. This is what Hootie...
It's FA-18, Danny. Come on. It's a very common reference to a very common naval, U.S. naval aircraft. Yes.
This is what F/A-18 asks. With the breakdown in the bipartisan foreign policy consensus as a consequence of collapsing U.S. hegemony abroad, is there space for different visions of U.S. foreign policy to be meaningfully contested either at the ballot box or through public opinion/pressure? He loves slashes. Or they. Or she. I find myself on the pessimistic no side of this, or at best that differing visions will be presented but not be decisive, while domestic culture war and tribalism will determine electoral success. But I'm curious about this question because we're definitely in a time of flux. Derek, you should answer this one first, and then I'll throw my 3 cents in.
Well, I'm not sure the bipartisan foreign policy consensus is actually breaking down. Like, I understand where the question is coming from, but meaningfully, what's been the difference between first? I think we have a great case study here because Trump is portrayed as such an outlier and so beyond the pale and so uncouth. And then we have sandwiched in between the two Trump terms the ultimate DC guy who's been in DC for, was in DC for 120 years. He's 180 years old.
Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Right. Considered himself to be like a foreign policy savant. You had, he's just that fucking good from his little press flunky or whatever. He doesn't have a PhD in foreign relations. He's just that fucking good. Like, this guy fancied himself as a grandee of foreign policy within the Democratic Party and an ultimate inside guy on foreign policy. And then, as I say, you got Trump on either side of him. And I don't there are certainly differences, but they're not differences that I think are salient to anybody who's actually voting or who's paying attention to politics, at least at the level of most people when they go to go to vote or when they're weighing candidates against each other, are paying attention to. Like, the differences with respect to the major the major thing that I think people were confronted with in the last election between the two parties on the ongoing genocide in Gaza are nil. There's nothing. There's no difference. I mean, Trump, if anything, got the Palestinians a brief respite. Now we might see some, more overt kind of insistence on an ethnic cleansing endgame, but we were going to have an ethnic cleansing endgame under Biden anyway, or under Kamala Harris. There's no, I've never seen the alternative path that the Israeli government was willing to head down, and there's been no indication from the United States. I guess the shift is from an administration that would have said, oh gosh, oh no, we don't like this. We really wish you wouldn't do this. No, please don't. While it happened and they did nothing, versus an administration where the president is just, let's turn it into the Riviera of the Mediterranean or the Eastern Mediterranean, whatever, like encouraging it. I guess that's a difference. I'm not sure it's a particularly material difference. There is a difference on Ukraine, certainly. I think, the spigot would still be on if Kamala Harris had won the election. But at the same time, I don't know how much longer it would have been on. That conflict has to come to an end at some point, and the United States is at some point going to say enough is enough, whether it's, Trump doing it like this in a very ham-fisted way that admittedly is probably going to be worse for the Ukrainians, or if it had been a Biden or Harris administration more gently kind of steering things in a direction of we can't sustain this and it's got to be over, which might have been a little bit better for Ukraine, but not much given the situation on the battlefield. I'm just not sure in the principal sense. Trump's back to bombing the Houthis again. We were doing that under Biden. All the main pillars here don't seem to change all that much. There's less window dressing about human rights under Trump. There's less, kind of playing at we're actually the good guys. Like, we're not allying with overtly with authoritarians. I guess there's more of that under Trump than there was under Biden. But yeah, so to that point, I'm not sure that we're at the point where this is really a contested thing yet. That said, certainly there's room to contest it at the ballot box, but you have to get people to care about it. That's the thing. It's to me, it's not that there isn't space to contest a different foreign policy vision, particularly one that puts the U.S. forward as one country among many, as opposed to the indispensable nation, which I think would be a wonderful change. But I think you have to find a way to make that matter to people. And Danny, I don't know, your views on this. I don't see us being at that point yet. There's still a lot of things about life in America that are tied up and sustained by the United States putting itself forward as the empire, as the indispensable nation, as the reserve currency, the holder of the reserve currency, as the country with scores of military bases all over the world. There's a lot that still rests on that, I think, for the way that people live, even in ways that they're not aware of. And some of them are detrimental, but others would be an upheaval if those things were to change, and they would be an upheaval for people. I'm not sure they'd be terribly thrilled to go through.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts about this. Um, I think that it's always going to be difficult to make people care about foreign policy in a country where they're not directly affected by the war, by war fighting and the maintenance of these imperial regimes. I think that was one of the great advantages of ending the draft, or more precisely, not renewing the draft in the early 1970s. As I've said before, if you remove the bourgeoisie from war fighting, that's going to allow you to use technology to maintain these global imperial bases. So I think that that allows something like primacy, military and economic primacy, which I think we're one could have predicted this, but we're always more important than the cultural primacy. That was really the focus of scholarly work in the 90s and 2000s. The military and economic primacy is certainly under the bipartisan consensus, and that I don't think any administration looking forward is going to turn that away, barring a change in politics, which is certainly coming, because I do think that the material capability of the United States to dominate the world is attenuating. It's going to attenuate slowly, but it's naturally going to attenuate. The G7 is just going to have less of the share of the global GDP. The United States is just not going to be able to project power in places like East Asia, as I've talked about before. And I think you actually see a subtle shift happening right now, at least according to my inside sources. Um, People within the military industrial complex, is that there has been a subtle shift away from the United States believing that it's going to be able to achieve full spectrum dominance in two gigantic wars. This was a really a de rigueur for US foreign policy in the post Cold War period. If you read any of the national security strategies, I'm sure it's even mentioned in NATO
I was
documents. The
very
idea was that,
explicit, like the ability to fight a two front war, to fight wars in two different parts of the world, like full scale wars, was always
yeah,
part of the doctrine. Yeah.
yeah, and it's called full spectrum dominance, right? That in every element of the war, information, military, economic, you're going to be able to win. I think there is a recognition within professional military circles that that's going to be more and more difficult to sustain over time. So I do see a change happening, as I think you could. This has been going on really since Obama, middle of Obama first term, is that the Middle East is of genuinely less importance to the United States. I think that regardless of the U.S. support for the Israeli government and Israeli military, the United States is less interested in that region, broadly speaking. I think the United States is less interested in Europe, broadly speaking, than it was for most of the 20th and first part of the 21st century. I believe the United States government, the officials within it, essentially want to maintain hegemony in East Asia, and they argue that scaling back from the Middle East and Europe is the way to do that. I think that's a quixotic goal. I don't think that's going to be able to last for a long time. So, in some sense, the material reality, the tectonic plates of international relations are changing, and wise, forward-thinking leaders would take account of that change and try to foster things like a security transition, would try to draw down the hundreds of military bases. But that's probably not going to happen just because the structure of our system is not especially democratic, especially when one thinks about foreign relations. And there's a lot of money to be made in these wars. And so I don't think that's going to happen. But there is this material change. So the question is, if that tectonic plate or those tectonic plates of international relations are changing in the medium term, will that eventually bring Americans to reflect those changes at the ballot box? And I think that we probably will see something like that eventually. It doesn't seem in the offing to my mind, let's say in the next 10 years, which one could reasonably draw out. But there's deep traditions in this country about being skeptical of the type of empire that the United States embraced after World War II. And there is a counterfactual world if the Nazis didn't defeat France so easily. And then if the Soviet Union didn't get the bomb in the way it did, and then if Mao didn't overtake China right after the Soviet Union got the bomb, if there would have been a different form of empire. I think the empire was coming, but the sort of it almost assumed its most extreme form in the early Cold War for a variety of reasons. The big three being that they just faced Hitler, Stalin could meaningfully be connected to Hitler, and the Soviets got the bomb, and then China immediately fell to the communists. Then you have the Korean War immediately after, and that funds the Cold War. There's a world where the US empire is not as expansive, it's not as well funded as it became if things turned out differently. So then the question is there going to be able to be a return to an almost pre-World War II tradition that's skeptical of the type of political military entanglements that the United States embraced at the height of its imperial dominance? And if that tradition is going to be engendered or rebirthed or re-excavated due to the material reality shifting on the ground, to me, that's inevitable. The question is when and how. If I had to guess, and I think I've said this before, it'll be like China doing something dramatic, and the U.S. just cuts and runs and say, "See you later, Japan."
Right.
See you later, South Korea, and enjoy Sinoization or Sinoification, whatever it is. That's what I would have to guess. But I do think that the U.S. is just going to not be able to remain dominant in the way that it has been fundamentally. Just the reality isn't there for that.
So I think uh, the external an external development like that forcing Americans to come to grips with the limits of what the empire is and is not at this point is one thing. But thinking about it from the perspective of can you contest these ideas without that or before we get to that point? I'm still skeptical that you can do that in a world where it's so far removed from anybody's day to day existence. And this is something that I think, we've talked multiple times. I mean, so often on this show, but it's a very clever thing that the establishment did to over the course of the 20th century after this initial flurry, the shock of World War II, the shock of the Soviets getting the bomb, the shock of, losing China, quote unquote, losing China in the Korean War, step by step over the rest of the century, taking decision making and then even the effects of empire off of the plate of most Americans, right? You create the national security state, which removes a lot of decision making from any sort of political back and forth or any change in Congress that's going to really affect what's going on in like the National Security Council or the institutions that run U.S. foreign policy. You take you get rid of the draft, so now we're down to a limited slice of Americans who actually have to go out and do the dirty work of being in the line of fire. You then even go beyond that and introduce uh, automated weapon systems, drones, taking it even further out of the realm where somebody's going to get hurt, and then you have families and people who are upset about that. And it's almost to the point now where you can run it like a video game. We're not quite there, obviously, but almost to the point where you can run it without really confronting anybody. And I think the big turning point for me was the moment after the September 11th attacks, where you had the president of the United States say, "Everybody go to the mall." Like, that's a joke. I mean, that's like that takes the concept of shared sacrifice or any of the things that we'd seen in past wars and just chucks it out the window in favor of like keep buying, keep consuming, sit on your ass and do nothing and just let us take care of it. And I still I wonder, how do you get anybody to care, or enough people, I shouldn't say anybody, but how do you get enough people to care about this stuff when on a day-to-day level they've just got other, you know bigger, and I'm bigger for them, certainly, and I don't begrudge anybody the way that they order their politics or their priorities, but this just seems so removed from anybody's lived existence, or from most people's lived existence.
Yeah, and I think that it might be worth just ending on this point that people are talking a lot about constitutional crises today, and for good reason. The Trump administration's obviously ignoring the judicial order not to send Venezuelan nationals to a Salvadoran prison. But we've kind of been living in a low level constitutional crisis since 1942. The United States has intervened, variously defined, intervene, you could define that in various ways, but probably around 200 times, a little over 200 times in foreign societies since World War II. And Congress hasn't declared war once or hasn't identified a belligerent once. So I think that this also relates to this larger issue of constitutional crisis. We've kind of been living in that world now for almost a century. And so I think it points to the need to focus on the structure of this actual system. People focus a lot on the politics and organization, and they should. But really, I think at this point, beyond what people do talk about when they refer to the structure, which is the Senate and the Electoral College in particular, which are obviously minoritarian institutions. But the literal structure of policymaking and decision making in this country is so profoundly anti-democratic and is so profoundly disconnected from, I would argue, what the Constitution or any democratic constitution would have intended, that we really need to focus on that structure. And then how that would be changed is it's problematic because that's not subject to electoral victories or non-victories. It's a very difficult problem, and I think if you don't address that actual structure of foreign policy making, then none of this is ever going to really change, or it'll change in a very dramatic way. Where the U.S. just says again, which I this if I had to predict, that's what would happen. Sort of, see ya. We're not fighting World War III over this, just like kind of what they
Right.
did in
Like,
Ukraine.
I think the
You
hope
know,
and the hope behind this question is that you could somehow change in advance or something like that. You could change course, you could change policy before there's a World War III that the United States pieces out of, or before climate change, destroys some load bearing element of human society. Like, can you do it in the absence of an external crisis like that? And yeah, I'm just not sure.
yeah, it doesn't seem that way. Well, Derek, always a pleasure. Everyone, thank you for listening. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the pod, join the Discord, ask us questions, and as always, keep on rocking in the free world. Bye.
Bye.